Hey everybody, my name's Yohaan Philip.
And I'm Matt Carville.
And we are live!
Every Tuesday afternoon for Live Lunch. That is the place that we take the Sunday teaching and we have a discussion about it. We unpack the different themes, ask some different questions, and we're inviting you to get involved in it. Have a listen or submit some questions, that sort of thing.
And we have food.
We do.
So if you want to find out about some good eating options around Brighton and Hove, tune into Live Lunch. So you get fed, well, we get fed physically, but you get fed spiritually. Tuesdays at 1 p.m. live on Instagram, then the video does sit on YouTube and podcast. If you'd like more information about how you can join in with the conversation at Live Lunch, weareemmanuel.com/live lunch. We look forward to seeing you there.
See you then.
We are live. Welcome back to a new season or series, if you're Matt Carville, of Live Lunch. We are in a new teaching series here at Emmanuel, looking at the story of Joseph. We've called the preaching series Buried. We'll get into that in a little bit. Let me introduce to you our host for the day. It is the wonderful Rachel Jeffs, who Rachel became a Christian through the live stream. She came across Emmanuel on the live stream, and so during lockdown she became a Christian, and now she helps lead our live stream delivery team, which is a wonderful trajectory and arc. And it's great to have you on the team, Rachel.
Amen.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. This is my debut of Live Lunch, so I'm normally behind the scenes, and now I'm here able to chat with you guys, so I'm really excited. And yeah, it was the live stream that kind of drew me in, and all the behind the scenes techie stuff, so thank you guys for being such a great comms team and producing all of this great content that
Man, feeling the love in the room today.
Seeds were sown.
It's great.
Great, thanks, Rachel. And we've got the wonderful Stephen Dawson, and who leads our New England site, and
Hello.
Dr. Tip. Is it?
There or thereabouts.
It's not
Tim
official
Jones.
yet.
Sorry,
There'll be a
sorry.
celebration.
We see this like every time you're on Live Lunch.
Mr. Slash Doctor.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it does happen.
So this week, last week we began our Buried series, the video with Neville Jones, or Joel. You got two options. You could either listen to Joel or Neville. That's available online, and both are really good preachers. So highly recommend listening to them. Why we call the series Buried? We looked at the story of Joseph, and there's a standard verse towards the end of the story, Genesis 15, the last chapter of the book of Genesis, where it talks about when Joseph is talking to I think his brothers, or is looking back on his life, and he talks about what you meant for evil, God intended for good, to save many people. And we know that really the story of Joseph points to Jesus. And so somebody was praying in our staff, right? We're not just preaching Joseph, we're preaching Jesus. And we see in the story of Joseph, really, it's like many stories in the Bible, that somebody is placed in a pit, is buried, and then risen to a position of prominence. And we look at the story of Joseph, and it's not just his dream that was buried, but he himself was buried. And similarly, it wasn't just the idea of salvation that was buried. No, Jesus was crucified, died, and placed in a tomb, buried, and then rose again. And I think how we can connect with the story is I think individually we know that quite often, sometimes we go through situations, where we feel like we ourselves are being buried. There's something overwhelming about the situation that we are going through, and just the beautiful knowledge that God knows what's going on. Indeed, He's working underneath the surface. The imagery of the series, the brand, really points to movement underneath the surface, and just the hope and the confidence that we have that God works all things out for good, and He's working when it seems like the situation is dead and buried, but He's working. And we've called the series Buried, but also Romans does talk about in Christ we too were buried, and the church, the body of Christ was buried with Christ, but then very much to be raised again. And so that's why we've called the series Buried. So yep, that's a quick introduction to Buried. You had a question which Tim's going to answer.
Yeah, I mean, it was just about this whole idea of being buried. I think from an outsider looking in, you can be like, why did Jesus have to be buried? And I guess that's something that came up when I was doing my notes, is like, one, why did He have to die on the cross? And two, why did He need to be buried?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great point. And it's only a couple of weeks ago that we were doing the run up into Easter. And so as I was speaking up at the Oasis site on this very subject, talking about Jesus saying on the cross, it's finished. So He actually does the killing of death using death. He does a judo move on death. On the cross, whereby death is put to death by death. So there's no more fighting for Him to do. So hence, when He goes to the grave, sometimes different traditions have talked about, different Christian traditions have talked about Jesus going down to fight, the enemies below, and to harrow the grave and to win back everyone from there. But really, when he says it's finished, it's finished. So it's finished on the cross. But then he lies down in solidarity with all of us who will die. And, you know, he's like us in every way. He goes through every experience, yet without sin and full of victory. Like retreads all of the steps of ancient Israel, but does it right. Gets taken out and tempted in the desert, but succeeds under temptation and withstands the devil. In this case, with burial, he goes down and is buried as will be buried, but death can't hold him. So he's the first resurrected from the dead, the first who walks the walk that we're going to walk. So the Christian hope, and when you get buried, you're playing this out. We will all die. When we're buried, we're planted like a seed, and we will be resurrected in a like manner to him. He's identified with us, and we will identify with him in that.
It's so fascinating what you shared about the Christian thing about burial. Is, you know, I've never thought about this before, but when you approach a burial or at the end of a funeral, it's quite like a sad moment. This is us saying goodbye to this person, never again to see them on the side of eternity. But really, what is actually happening is it's like a seed that's being buried. So, you know, when you bury seeds, you're not sad that you're not going to see a seed.
Well, not normally, no.
But there's like hope and there's anticipation and joy
I think we have to take seriously the sorrow of death.
Absolutely.
Death is sorrowful. It's sorrow for us left behind. It's sorrowful for the dying as well. It is an imposition. It's an enemy, and it's the last enemy, and it's going to be defeated in its totality in our experience. But I mean, 1 Corinthians 15 talks about the body of the believer being sown as perishable, as killable, as susceptible to dying, but raised imperishable.
Amen.
And then it says in the next verse as well, is sown in dishonor, sown in kind of shame and dishonor, but raised in glory. And it's important to remind ourselves, especially in a kind of post-Christian age that we live, why do we do this kind of thing? Why should you bury? There's a report that's come out this week from Theos think tank called Ashes to Ashes, and it's looking at the trends and changes that people's attitudes to death and dying have undergone. We've got Dying Matters Week coming up in 2 weeks' time as well. So I mean, there is a general turn towards like kind of the positive dying movement, if anyone's heard of that. That people, even in secular society in the country, are trying to turn their attention back to how one copes with dying, and to get people making wills again, just all the practicalities about it, because we do live in a culture that's forgotten a lot of these bearings. One of those bearings is this idea of burial in hope, and there's something we can really serve the country in generally in bringing the rationale behind why we do these things back into conversation. I mean, it doesn't matter in a sense if people don't agree on the first hearing with that, but now at least they know why a Christian would do that kind of thing, and they can start wrestling with the idea and start thinking about death in a spiritual sense as well as just practical sense.
So good. Thank you, Tim. Stephen, do you want to, we've talked a lot about the buried series and buried, we haven't really gotten to the preach. Do you want to give us a quick summary of?
Yep, so from this sermon, it's a bit of a sermon of two halves. One, I guess the first half, I really tried to show us that Joseph is a type of Jesus. So as we look at the Bible, I said on Sunday that in every page we're looking for Jesus. You know, Jesus, when he met his disciples, showed them that was the case, right from Moses, the prophets, actually right through, that he is actually the reason for the book, and it all points to him. And sometimes that's not that easy to find. I think we often need some help from our Bible teachers and preachers. I think in reality, the book of Joseph, anyone can go looking and will see that actually he is a type of Jesus, or to put it another way, that Jesus is the greater Joseph. And so particularly in this passage, there's loads to point back, like as Tim said, we just come out of the story of Easter, and you just see the story of Easter all over this particular chapter, as Joseph is sent out by his father to find his brothers as he's thrown in a pit and betrayed by them. And we obviously get to the resurrection bit, that's a few chapters away, but just this narrative we see working its way. So a lot of it's just looking at Jesus, which is always wonderful to do, then looking at how does God deal with people. And I love I just love the story of Joseph personally. He's probably one of my favourite characters in the Bible, because you just see how God works in life, knowing that all of us have difficulties and trials and pits that we have to go through. And how do we navigate that? And where's God in the midst of that? And those are really good questions to ask. And all of us need to have a really strong theology of pain and difficulty and how do we face it. And so hopefully did some work to help people kind of grapple with those things on Sunday.
I think let's kick the discussion off with the whole thing of trials and hardships and pain. I think some of the things I'd like to talk about, if we do get time, is to look at the place of forgiveness. Joseph experienced some really horrible betrayal from his brothers. Also the place of forgiveness in our own society today. There is a lot of pain and hurt in society. How do we tackle some of those? How do we bring forgiveness into play? It's world surrounded by cancel culture. We looked about. So Joseph had his multicolored coat, which got ripped up by his brothers and dipped in goat's blood. But as believers, we've been given a new coat of Christ. How do we live in that identity? And then if you do get time, the trajectory of pit to palace and our view on trajectory and career and those kind of things, if our view of authority. So let's kick us off with the whole with pain and trials and hardships. What would be some helpful practical tips or things that you would encourage people listening and maybe people who are going through hardships to find grace and God in it?
You, me?
Rachel, feel free to jump into anything.
I have to say, for me, the Word of God. And so this particular story has been really personally helpful in the last year or so. And when the schedule for who was going to preach what passage came out, I was thrilled that my name was against this. And if it hadn't been, I would have fought for it to be the case. Because it has been I didn't put a lot of it into the sermon on Sunday. I didn't want it to be about me. I wanted to help people. But personally, it's been really helpful, I think, just letting God speak to you through these passages. And again, just that there's something about this, the helplessness of Joseph in this situation. He's thrown a pit. He cannot get out. He cannot control his situation and his destiny. And I think often that's the case. The place we're in. Sometimes we're just in situations thinking, I did not make this situation. And there's definitely moments where I've been speaking to God saying, God, this is not good. And this isn't good for me. It's not good for the people I love. And I'll be trying to tell God, this is the narrative, God. Like, if you could just begin to line up with how I think the story should be playing out. This is the story of my life. And this pit is not part of it. And God, you just need to get up to speed with Stephen's plan here. And I think the story of Joseph just so helps me that I have such a limited view. For Joseph to go from being essentially a shepherd in a kind of agrarian society to be a regal administrator over a whole region. That couldn't be just a job interview gets. He had to go through something to get there. There's some stuff that needs to happen. Literally had to move him like geographically, had to strip away some identity stuff, had to do some inner work in his heart. And God knows the best way for that to happen. And so there's moments in my life I'm thinking, this looks like an ugly pit. There's nothing good about it. And this is not the story I have playing out. And it's not good for my brothers. It's not good for me. But God knows. God knows what's right for me. God knows what's right for my brothers. And I love this story. It's not just that Joseph's vindicated. His brothers who did him evil, they are fed. They are saved. And Joseph is the instrument of that. God, how you construct it so it's a win-win-win. And often you look at a situation thinking, this is a lose-lose for everything. But you just cannot see things from God's position. And so I think getting into the Bible, saying, God, I'm looking at my situation. God, teach me your ways. Teach me how you really deal with people. Really helps us. And just getting a security in God. It's secure that your will, your way, Lord, not mine. And so, yeah.
But when you were saying that just now, it made me think. So you gave a cross section of what your prayer might be in a certain situation where you're in a pit. It's not good for me. It's not good for the brothers. It's not good for whoever. And it sounded like you were stopping short of saying, and you might have said this in prayer. This is my question: have you ever said to God in prayer, "This is"? Have you ever said, "And this is not good for you"?
Yeah,
your reputation, God.
Oh God, this isn't even bringing you glory. This is messy and painful. Your reputation's on the line, Jesus. I've got your back covered, God. Just do things my way, and it's going to work out. I've got it covered.
The funny thing is, but there's kind of biblical precedent for that as well. So you do see those kind of arguments happen between Abraham and saving Sodom and things like this, where you're saying, what are you going to look like if you do this?
Yeah.
How will anyone know that you're, and actually it seems to actually form a legitimate part of honest prayer.
Yeah, I was about to say that's just like an example of just going to God and just being so genuine and honest. And I find that off the back of what you said, Stephen, about going to the Word when you're feeling overwhelmed and you're in a pit and you need help, like going to the Word is so great because it's literally showing you who God is through stories, through people and through their experiences. But for me, like a big thing I would say would be prayer, but not just kind of doing the motion of prayer, Father, but actually just being like, hey, I feel like this and this, and can you kind of help me out of that? And actually changing that to an honest prayer has really shaped my
pouring
relationship.
out your heart.
Yeah, exactly. And I find that near the end I'm giving thanks anyway, but it's like almost as if you've got to get that stuff off your chest, and God being the person who wants to be the first person you talk to about these things, because I think often I will go on my phone and text someone, which is great and it's lovely to have friends and family for support, but actually God wants you to be the first person that he, that you go to for that.
I think I've been helped recently. I was speaking to another pastor. We're just talking about the whole issue of hurt, and so we don't need to pretend that hurt isn't hurt. It's not sinful to admit that your pain or something hurts. So that very famous verse that Yohaan read earlier, he said, "You meant it for evil." Like it was evil, it was hurt, it was pain, but God can use it for good, and it's looking at that. But it's not diminishing the fact that these things are painful. Yeah. And we talk to brothers and sisters about it. We don't want to moan or complain about anything. But we can lament, and we can be real and sympathise and empathetic. Jesus wept over the pain of his friends, even though he knew he was going to undo that pain. But the pain was the pain, and I think just being real in prayer, like I said about that, is helpful.
Just digging deep into what you asked about how this is not good for your own glory. It could feel like the season, broadly speaking, that the church is in at the moment is not one of influence. It's not one with a strong voice. It's not one which is shaping the course of countries and politics. In some ways, it could almost be seen as the opposite. Like
that said, in this country, the church is doing most of the feeding of the poor. So carry on.
Yeah. How would you encourage Christians who are feeling like I do want to stand up in the work situation that I'm in and bring godly counsel in, but I'm afraid that I'll be shut down because you're Christian, and that's just what their Bible says. What encouragement would you bring to them?
I didn't think that's where you were going to land with your question, so I'm going to may I make a comment first?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think not worrying about vindicating God or yourself. Like I say, God knows. God is secure in who He is. Like He doesn't mind people thinking this, that, and the other. He'll just do what He does. I think that's encouragement to us, and we're just called to be faithful. We don't actually need to worry so much about the outcome, even our own vindication. I think that's still something I'm learning, and I'm very good at saying the right things in the right place. But all guys are ugliness in my heart. I want to be, justice. I want people to see things rightly, all that stuff. For my own self. But laying that down because God's just. God's just perfect example in that, and His help to do the same. I think with the church as well. It's like, well, we're not really. If your motivation is for the world to think great things of church, you build funny shaped churches. Suddenly you're very careful about what you say, what you do, how you're seen, how you appear. Now, we don't want to be offensive for offensiveness' sake, but there are bits about the gospel, lots of bits about the gospel and the life that God calls us to live that are countercultural, that people won't understand or they won't like, and it's and we want to learn how to communicate them well and to know the reason for our faith to be able to defend it. But if we start from a point of wanting influence or wanting a hearing, and that's just the main motivation, I think very quickly you can veer in the wrong direction. The answer is to keep seeking God's kingdom, keep being faithful with it, trusting that at the right time, God's name will be vindicated. And I think Tim's point's a great one. Actually, we get on with feeding the poor. Actually, that wins us a hearing. We know that's the case for us, even as a church. We had someone come along who was involved with some of the work that we used to do with the poor. Always said, I must actually come and check out what this church is like. They're taking 5 years to do it, but they're now around us, looking into our church because they saw something in the heart of how we treat other people. And just trusting, actually, as we are kingdom people and do things God's way, actually, He'll look after all of it.
Which is Joseph's story. Joseph fed the starving.
Yeah, it absolutely flows out of how you've been treated by God. Like so for the church to be authentic, it's not that you're just doing works of mercy to impress people or to merely gain a hearing. You're doing it because that's how God is.
Yeah.
In God's self, God is generous and a father and a provider and a lover of your soul, and has done these things to you. You're just reflecting it. You're saying, okay, well, if the thing that every human being is supposed to be is a God imager, and what Jesus has now made it possible for us to do in lifting all of our sin and guilt from us is to clean the mirror and to make it so that we reflect the God who is. We reflect Him like this, so we carry on being merciful even if we're treated harshly, and we shouldn't underestimate the great privilege and freedom that we do have in this country. Even in a post-Christendom time, we are allowed to be church, and the light is allowed to shine, and so that's an amazing gift. That we want to just lean into that full strength. That He's loved us so that we can love. So,
Brilliant.
I think there's just off the back of what Stephen was saying about faithfulness, and I think some people on the outside looking in can think of faithfulness as a weakness. And I was studying, I've just finished doing the Book of Acts, and I came to this conclusion that there's so much strength in faithfulness, and it's also smart, because in the Bible, they go back to the Old Testament and they say, well, God moved in this way, and look at the people who went against God, look what happened to them. And so we as Christians are doing that too, and we're saying, okay, but look at all these people that have had experiences with God, and look at where He's taken them, and look at the promises He's answered. So actually having faith in someone that, He may not have moved in your life yet, but you can look back at people who He has moved in and be like, I've got faith off the back of that.
Can you define faithfulness for me? Just give a sentence. What you mean by it?
I mean, I guess just trusting and having faithfulness, as in that God is going to deliver His promises.
Right. So because we use it in different ways. You can talk about being faithful in a relationship or something like that.
Yeah, it's different.
It is, but it's not a million miles away. But it's important just to hear what you're saying there. So when you say your conclusion after reading through the Book of Acts, which is the actions of the Christians in the early church, straight after the ascension of Jesus, when he commissions them, says, right, you be my body and you do the stuff. Your takeaway from it is that faithfulness is the hallmark.
Well, there was many takeaways, but I think one of the things was that they were using past stories to kind of back up their claims of God, but then also you see in it people having a message from God and not really understanding it. For example, when I think it was Ananias got a vision for going to cure Paul from being blind, and he was like, but Paul just killed all these people, Paul's being all of this, so why are you asking me to do this? But then he trusts that God is true and he has faith, so then he goes and does it. And then also Galileo, I think, says stuff about people in the Old Testament, and he's like, oh, this happened to God, and it just gave me a vision of well, God can use people even though they don't know how they're being used, and then just you having that step of faith to not just sit back in silence but actually act upon what God's calling you to do.
You know this from when we do intern sessions. You're one of our interns here, which is great, and I teach the interns sometimes, and one of my preferred ways of translating faith in our context is to talk about trust. Because the problem is faith gets such an empty word. You can say to someone, I'm growing in my faith, and they won't even ask you a question. If you said, I'm growing in my trust, they would say to you, in what? And that's the question that should be asked of anyone who says, I'm growing in my faith, or I'm exploring my faith. In what? What is it in? So I hear what you're saying there. It's actually a trust and a leaning into precedent in the way that God has acted, in the way that God has dealt with people. Yeah,
and he does kind of, in my mind, it was like this nail in the coffin type thing. God will show you one thing, and then He'll show you another thing, and then He'll show you another thing, and that kind of building faith. And Paul literally seeing a vision and then hearing a word and then getting someone to go and cure his blindness. It's and in my life, I can definitely experience how God has moved, and I write down every time he's done something, because we so often forget what God has done for us, but actually looking at the fruit of what God can produce in our lives, not just the Bible characters, but literally us, and then being like, okay, but how can we dispute him, because he's done so many things, and this is truth, and I think you can't argue with truth either. So yeah, so that's strong.
It's great.
It's great.
Really good, mate. I think jumping into, the whole, we talked about betrayal and forgiveness. And this is not going to be the be all and the end all of the conversation around forgiveness and hurt and how we respond to that. But it is fascinating. The arc of Joseph's story it starts with this horrific betrayal. His brothers didn't sell him into slavery, but they they facilitated the process in a sense, to him coming around to forgiving them towards the end of the story. I find it fascinating that Joseph doesn't seek forgiveness or restoration of the relationship before his brothers come to him.
Interesting. The different things, forgiveness and reconciliation, are different.
Yes. Let's look at them separately.
There's no evidence that Joseph goes to seek them out. He might have done. He might be busy, running a whole region, kind of collecting for 7 years and then distributing for 7 years.
Busy job, yeah.
Busy Joseph. Who knows? And I do like your thought though. Why didn't he? But that's not to say he didn't forgive. And I think in one sense, if you wait till you go and meet someone and get all your explanations before you forgive, you're probably. I would suggest it's the wrong way around.
So how do we hold that intention? Do we actively seek resolution or reconciliation? Do we actively seek reconciliation? I think forgiveness in some ways is you and God, and I'm not saying one is easier than the other, but it is very much something you do within your heart. Then the act of reconciliation is almost like thrusting yourself into a vulnerable position.
Well, I think the forgiveness, easy is the wrong word. It's more it's simple.
Yes.
Like God said, I forgive you. You're to go and forgive others. You're giving over that offence to God for God to deal with, and choosing to not hold it against them anymore. It's simple. Is it easy? No, it's not. But it's simple in that sense. I think again, preaching through the Easter story, Jesus literally Father, forgive them. These people just betrayed you. These people, he doesn't know. I'm going to choose to forgive, and the fact that Jesus teaches us in his daily
prayer. No one's
prayer.
saying sorry to him or anything.
No one's saying sorry. Absolutely no. But they just think they think it's crazy. They don't know you're the one who did wrong. I think knowing that with forgiveness, we're not waiting for reconciliation. We're not waiting for someone to admit that they're wrong. We're choosing to forgive them. It's difficult. It's definitely a work of God. So Holy Spirit, help us. It's also, I think, but I don't know what it was before we went online, but we're saying it just makes sense. There's that whole, I think it's a Nelson Mandela quote, or it's been at least been attributed to him. Unforgiveness is like pouring a cup of poison and drinking yourself.
Right.
That bitterness and hurt you have towards someone. They're walking around happy as Larry in the world, but you're feeling the depth of it, and it crushes you. And so forgiveness is saying, I am not going to live in that space. I'm going to give that to God. God to do what He wants. And the harder bit is then working out the reconciliation bit, because sometimes you've been hurt by people where it's not appropriate. If you go and reconcile, so abusive situations with you don't put yourself back in an abusive situation. Other times it's hard because they don't see it from your own narrative, and sometimes they'll maybe just see a little bit of it. So it means you can begin to move towards one another. But you don't want to try and start doing that until you've forgiven in reality.
I guess like a broader question then, in a lot of maybe like some of the social movements that we've seen in our time, like some of the really strong opposition against abuse or racism, social injustice, all of those things. Not wanting to lump them all into one thing as if one answer will fix everything. But what should the Christians' attitude be towards reconciliation in this instance? Or how do they play out forgiveness in this instance? People who've maybe been on the receiving end of abuse, or maybe people who've been perpetrators of abuse. The church is a space for everybody. I guess what can we learn from the story which will speak into our lives?
I think there's one thing that's really obvious. The phrase that we keep coming back to, which is the end of the story, we keep spoilering it for everyone by talking about you meant it for evil, God meant it for good. I don't know if Joseph would have seen that all the way through, and especially at the juncture that we're looking at. Yeah. If you like Vox popped him at that particular point and said, "Hey, how's it going? Did they mean it for evil and God mean it for good?" He'd be like, "I'm in a pit." That's all I know at this juncture. However, at the end, I think it's important, and here's the lesson for us, that he verbalizes to them. He says to them, "You meant it for evil." That bit's important. Before you move on to it, he's actually reflected to them, "You meant it for evil," because you don't do someone who's hurt you a service by not reflecting to them what that's been. And there's going to be wisdom about how that comes out in different ways, but part of it is actually serving them by saying, "This is what went wrong." Maybe you still don't even see eye to eye. Do you know? Maybe you've been cancelled for this, that, or the other, and you verbalise to them, "You stopped my voice. That hurt, but I forgive you." I've got enough going on that I've got trust in more than just the situation that we're in. Do you see? So I think that would be one thing I'd say for us. It's actually the verbalizing of the hurt along with the forgiveness, so that you're from an attitude of service, that you're not there just saying, "This is what you did and this is what," it's not accusatory. It's not coming with that heat. It's coming with a sense of, I would be not serving you if I didn't actually spell out what's wrong.
Yeah, it's that thing of forgiveness is not saying you weren't wronged. It's not excusing it. I think it's so important. Somebody like, "How can I forgive that? It was so bad."
It's necessarily saying that you were wrong, or that there was
and
a
it
wrong.
Also doesn't overdo the hurt that's already been caused. It doesn't. There's damage that can be done, and then there's forgiveness, and there's a beauty in that, and there's a renewal. But actually, the stuff that's happened in the past has still happened, and there's repercussions from our actions, from our words, that are still very real. So it's not just saying it's all in the past and it's all forgotten about.
No, it's just madness.
And there's consequences, and often it's important to get other people involved. Even the law at points, doesn't mean those things shouldn't be. Forgiveness really is about that heart attitude. In fact, I was talking to someone yesterday about, did they have any particular unforgiveness in a situation? And they were saying, well, there's definitely things I need to talk to another person about. There's things I need to go through with them about. There's not unforgiveness in my heart. Right. So I very explicitly said, "No, could you break bread with this person? Could they commune?" Like, hey, absolutely. Is there further conversation at a point needed? Yeah, there is.
That's a great Christian diagnostic question as well. Can you break bread? Because there's warnings against this. Don't eat and drink judgment on yourself.
And I have found myself in years gone by where I think I've forgiven someone, and I realise what's happened is actually I've just not seen them. And then you see them raising their hands across the room in worship, and you're like, "Oh yes,
you with your hands up,
there you are."
Look at that.
And it's like, let's take Jesus bread and wine for the forgiveness of your sins. I'm like, how am I going to take this right now? Well, I'm holding that against them. How can I? And that's when the parable of the unforgiving servant. It's the most brilliant story. It's so convicting. Every time you read it, thinking, God, you've forgiven me so much. My wretchedness is just more than I'll ever be able to comprehend. And you forgive me. How can I hold this thing against that person?
And I think it is the forgive 70 times 7. Where someone thinks they're being clever, saying to the Lord, "Oh, forgive 7 times. That's pretty good." It's like, times it up. Square that.
Thank you so much. We've come to the end of our show. I feel like there's so much more to talk about.
I just want to give a little shout out to this Happy Mackie. Yes. This was really nice.
Happy Mackie.
Yes.
Thank you, Happy Mackie.
Sushi burrito. Come on now.
Sponsored by, no, not sponsored.
Well, they can if they like.
And it's vegan as well.
It is vegan.
Multiple
and it's a
ones.
sushi
Not
burrito.
usually an aficionado of the vegan, but you've made a case.
Yeah, it's been
Yeah,
nice.
I'm not going to say you've made a case.
Okay, all right. We won't go overboard. But yeah.
Thanks so much for joining us. Next Sunday, or the Sunday that's coming up, we've got the story of Judah and Tamar, which is personally one of my favorite stories in the Bible because I don't give the spoilers away, but it's an extraordinary story of God's grace. And you see the kind of people that God works through, and it gives you so much hope for just sin in your life and mess in your life.
God, there's no mess too big.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's a must listen to preached. We've got the wonderful Matt Cobbs speaking to us. But thanks so much for joining us, and we see you next week.
Les.